We have 100,000 people dead in Iraq because of that war that we started. We invaded. We did the war. We were the war. And then you went into Libya and you supported regime change.
That's a very different
Well, why do you keep wanting to do these things of regime change? What's in your thinking that says the United States government has some right and duty to go to Middle Eastern countries and knock off their leadership?
Well, you know,
and I think you were more aggressive when knocking off Bashar Assad too.
Well, let me tell you what I believe, and then you people can make their own judgment. I've said Iraq was a mistake. I've said that what I thought the strategy was, which was to let the inspectors finish and to find out, and if necessary, to be able to then put pressure of a different kind on Saddam Hussein, wasn't allowed to go forward. So that we know. Libya was very different. You know, I think conflating the two does a disservice.
But the principle of regime change, what do you make of it?
No, look.
Constantly trying to knock off their leaders.
No, that is just an overstatement that doesn't really reflect the situation.
Don't you support knocking off Assad, Bashar Assad?
I think that given the bloodshed he has spilled, that would be a good outcome, but Americans aren't going to do it. That's not us doing it. Americans aren't going to do it. That's not us doing it. In Libya, you had a dictator who had American blood on his hands. Remember, Reagan tried to knock him off, as you recall, because you were working in the Congress, missed when he tried. When he said that he was going to track down his people and murder them, the Europeans and the Arabs came to us and said, you've got to help us, because what they feared is what we see in Syria. What they feared was an out-of-control civil war on their shores, right across the Mediterranean, right next to Egypt, right next to the rest of the Middle East. Remember, we had those countries helping us in Afghanistan in our very big coalition. Now, when somebody that has helped you, their people have died, they have expended their treasure to help us, come and say, this is personal to us. We in Europe, we in the Middle East. Is the United States supposed to say, you know what, that's not our problem? You know, and they can say to us, yeah, Afghanistan wasn't our problem either. But that's not the way you work with allies and way you build coalitions. So what did we do there? We provided our unique abilities, and they ran most of the air missions. They were really very much involved in helping to, cordon off Libya and in eventually defeating Gaddafi and his forces. Now, is Libya perfect? It isn't. But did they have 2 elections that were free and fair where they voted for moderates? Yes, they did. So, changing from a dictator who has hollowed out your country to something resembling a functioning state, and even hopefully more of a democratic one, doesn't happen overnight. And we've got to continue to support the Libyan people, to give them a chance, because otherwise you see what's happened in Syria with the consequences of millions of people flooding out of Syria, with more than 250,000 people killed, with terrorist groups like ISIS taking up almost a huge swath of territory, as big as some of the states in that area. So, yes, I mean, Libya was a different kind of calculation, and we didn't lose a single person. We didn't have a, problem in supporting our European and Arab allies in working with NATO, and now we've got to support the
What do you
Libyan
think,
people.
quickly, of the whole history of the United States in your lifetime of knocking off leaders, whether it was Mossadegh in Iran, or it was Arbenz in Guatemala, or knocking off Allende in Chile, or knocking off Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, or knocking off Trujillo, or who else have I missed? I mean, we've been doing this for a long time. That's why I'm skeptical. But what is your view of all those assassinations, all those attempts to change the history of other countries? Should we be doing that kind of thing?
Well, I don't think
knocking off leaders.
In the vast
CM, we knocked him off.
In the vast majority of cases, the answer is no. But there's always these historical games you can play. If somebody could have assassinated Hitler before he took over Germany, would that have been a good thing or not? You cannot paint with a broad brush. Individual situations, and most of the ones you named are ones that I think in retrospect did not have a very defensible kind of calculation behind them. But I think it's a mistake to say you can't ever prevent war. You can't ever save people. If there had been a way to go after the leaders of the massacres in Rwanda, to stop that before 800,000 people were killed, what would we have done? We do, as you know very well, target terrorists. We target them because we believe that they are plotting and planning against us, our friends, and our allies. Now, they may not be a head of state, but they are very well the head of a terrorist group. So these are tough, hard choices. That's why I wrote a whole book called Hard Choices.
Already, anyway.
She has tried to persuade Democrats that she would not be more hawkish.
And then the speech she just gave to AIPAC was about the most disgustingly militaristic, hawkish.
Smart. Were you smart about Iraq, endorsing the president's position on Iraq? Did you believe ever that Saddam Hussein, when you had to cast that vote to authorize the war in Iraq, did you ever believe that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons?
I did.
Who told you?
Well, I know at the end of the Clinton administration, there was a very strong sense that he was reconstituting his nuclear weapons program. And I like to remind people that at the end of the 90s, there was a sense of the Congress passed that my opponent, Bernie Sanders, voted for, basically talking about regime change in Iraq because of the threat of potentially nuclear, biological.
That was neocon stuff.
Well, Bernie Sanders voted for it.
I don't know why he did.
Well, Chris, I'm just telling you that that was the prevailing opinion. And what, look, I've said it was a mistake because.
No, and I want to know about the facts, because if you were told by somebody that he had nuclear weapons, they weren't telling the truth. Because Mike Morrell, who's the chief CIA briefer on this subject, told me on my show that they never told anybody, because he said we had no evidence they had nuclear weapons. So who, if it wasn't the CIA, told you they had nuclear weapons?
Well, what was going on was a continuing intensive inspection program. Hans Blix, remember Hans Blix?
I remember it all.
And Hans Blix and his team of inspectors were trying to get to the bottom of this. Now, here's what was misleading, is that Saddam Hussein could have ended it immediately. He could have said, come anywhere, look anywhere, we have nothing. But he didn't choose to do that. And so the inspectors were racing to get to all the sites that they were worried. Because remember, at the end of the first Gulf War, we did find evidence of a nuclear weapons program. Then we had a number of years where we were flying a no-fly zone over Iraq, and where we saw him diverting a lot of money into not just building palaces, but building, we thought, programs.
Dick Cheney's all over the country back in the fall of 2002 saying Saddam has nuclear weapons. Not a nuclear weapons program, nuclear weapons, even though the CIA never told him that. The question is Donald Trump right when he said they lied?
Well, I think that what Mike Hayden and others have said is that it was an intelligence failure. Now, I don't know.
No, but they never said they had nuclear weapons. How could it be a failure?
Well, they led some people to believe that.
Yeah, but not with evidence. But not with evidence. You didn't have evidence they had nuclear weapons, did you?
What we had was let me speak for myself.
You never had evidence of nuclear weapons?
No, but that was because the inspection program had not been completed. And where I stood, I believed George W. Bush when he said, we are going to let the inspectors finish the job. Yeah. This vote will give me the leverage, he claimed, to make sure that happens. Read Hans Blix's book.
Why did you trust W?
Well, I thought that using diplomacy, which is what it seemed to me he was offering, made a lot of sense.
Did he seem the diplomatic type, W?
He seemed to be someone who, in my opinion, at least rhetorically, that speech he gave in Cincinnati was aimed at saying we're going to let the inspectors finish. Now, he didn't let the inspectors finish. And that's where I made a mistake, because if he had let the inspectors finish, what Blix and others argue is they would have been able to prove to the world. So if there had been any doubt, whether manufactured or believed, it would have been ended. And that's why, you know, I've said repeatedly it was a mistake for me to
Why was
give him that
Bernie
vote.
Sanders right and you were wrong? What do you think was in him that allowed him to see what you couldn't see?
Well, I don't know, because he voted, as I said, for the regime change resolution.
Well,
Well, it was only a few.
It was rhetorical.
It was only a few years earlier. And, you know, look, that was a mistake, and I've said it was a mistake. And I had good friends like Vice President Biden who were with me, and I had good friends who were on the other side. And I think part of what certainly influenced me is after 9/11, you know, I went to New York with Chuck Schumer the next day, my fellow senator. We were the only plane in the sky, and we flew over Ground Zero, and we saw the devastation. And we were briefed fully on all of the threats that were still out there. We get back to Washington. I go and see then Senator Byrd, get him to commit to helping New York, because the first request out of the White House was for $20 billion for the Pentagon, for Homeland Security, not a penny for New York. So I went and said, look, we have to get money for New York. When I went to the White House, there were about 4 of us senators, the 2 from Virginia, the 2 of us from New York. Yeah. And I knew that the Republicans in the White House and in the Senate didn't want to rebuild New York, or at least they weren't willing to put money into it. So I'm sitting there in the Oval Office, and Bush says to me, what do you need? I said, I need $20 billion to rebuild you know, New York. He said, you got it. And he was good to his word. So my experience with him on something of great import to our country was positive, because literally that same day I get back to the Capitol and the Republicans are trying to take that money away. We kept calling the White House. Bush kept saying, I gave them my word. I'm going to stick with it. So, you know, I had a different set of experiences.
No, but we have 100,000 people dead in Iraq because of that war that we started. We invaded. We did the war. We were the war. And then you went into Libya and you supported regime change.
That's a very different.
But why do you keep wanting to do these things of regime change? What's in your thinking that says the United States government has some right and duty to go to Middle Eastern countries and knock off their leadership?
Well, you know.
And I think you were more aggressive when knocking off Bashir Assad too.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank God for Bernie Sanders, Senator from Vermont. And thank God, thank you. Stay alone, brother. I thank the chair. I weep for my country. I've watched the events of recent months with a heavy, heavy heart. No more is the image of America one of strong yet benevolent peacekeeper.